So, hello everybody. Very nice to kind of meet you all. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a true pleasure. And first of all, there is this dual me and my slides kind of setup. Recommendation: minimize my face. It's not as interesting as the slides, hopefully, but definitely you need a good sized view on the slides. You will see that there are tons of details. So we're going to talk about gamification, surprise, surprise, game-based learning and intrinsic aspects of game-based learning. And basically, this is going to be what we're going to talk about. I'm introducing a challenge that I am facing, particularly in my field of interest. Then the way I am tackling this challenge through a human factors approach. Then we're going to have a little bit of a group activity as an interlude, and then we're going to wrap up this presentation. So let's start with what I deal with, which is complex learning. And by this, I don't mean complicated learning. It's actually way more than complicated learning. So first and foremost, it's about purposeful learning and how to enhance motivation and ability to operate in complex conditions. So why is all this more than just complicated? Essentially, what I'm talking about is problem solving in complex conditions driven by purpose. So I'm not talking about a specific domain, and usually these kind of situations that we call wicked problems are transdisciplinary, but I'm definitely talking about people needing to learn how to address situations which are characterized by continuous change. So when you are dealing with a complicated problem, what happens is that it's difficult, but you can eventually figure it out. It's going to be a matter of time, it's going to be a matter of money, but the information is there, the resources are there. You just need to find them, then put them together and solve the problem, go from A to B. Whatever the problem is about, that's it. It's complicated, take time, money, solve it. When you have complex situations, this is not the case because everything changes and it changes continuously. And actually, you have to you have to learn how to negotiate with uncertainty, unpredictability, unknowability, and uncontrollability. You have to adapt continuously. You have to strategize, monitor, change, strategize, monitor, change to manage a situation and drive the situation towards what you think is a good state. So there is no correct answer, there is no established method, and there is a lot of tough decision making to do. And all this requires, learning how to manage these situations requires integrative learning. So you have to learn how to think, feel, and do, and you have to do that as you actually act. So this is not about getting prepped to tackle these kind of situations. You don't just learn, for example, how to become a strategist, but you learn as you are operating as a strategist, and so on and so forth. So this kind of learning is inevitably driven and influenced by authentic activity. And this is one of the things that characterize the work that I do. So, of course, there's room to enhance all this via game-based element. But you need to understand, because of this strong tie between the learning process and the authentic activity, you really have to be into the game to learn how to play the game. To gamify something, you're bound to that activity. You cannot just come up and invent a new game or change that activity too significantly, because the people that you want to help to learn are people who are already playing a game. They already start with a basis of motivation. They already have some kind of purpose attached to the kind of activities that they want to master. And what you want to do, you want to help them to improve their learning and to become better at the game that they are already playing. So there isn't too much that you can change. And because of that, you need to understand what is it that they are already learning. So what is it that the activity is already intrinsically making them learn? So it's a bit of a change of focus rather than saying this is what I would like them to learn and who are they. you start with looking at the activity. So um, that is why we use different approaches. I use different approaches, and I rely on my background to actually engage and help these people from a human factors perspective. Who are these people? Well, it's a variety of people who need to tackle this kind of complex problem situations. You have pilots, you have military pilots, for example, scientists, um, business strategists, you name it. You have a broad range of people who need to learn how to negotiate complexity. And of course, you have students in formal education, right? So it's quite broad. Now, I mentioned before that the way I tackle this situation is through a human factors and ergonomics approach. Now, when people hear about ergonomics, they usually think about this, right? So, and actually, I've been asked quite often. So, you design chairs, right? Well, that's not entirely incorrect, but actually, it's a bit of a limited view on what human factors is. Basically, human factors and ergonomic specialists, what they do is dealing with systems and particularly socio-technical systems. So what they do is analyzing systems in which people have to interact with one another for a purpose. And the whole system has purpose. People have purposes within the system, which may or may not be aligned with the purpose of the whole system. And to pursue all this set of purposes, they interact with each other, and they interact with technology, and they interact through technology. So we try to figure out what the elements of these systems are, how they interact, what the purpose of the system is, what the purpose of people within the system is, and then how to improve everything. How to improve the situation of people who interact, their well-being, their performance, their learning, and the overall efficiency and efficacy of the system. So that's pretty much what HFE people do. And the way we do that is by modeling systems and then redesigning systems and relying on relevant theories to do that and evidence from past practice. So it's fascinating work. Sometimes it's hell, and it's definitely multidisciplinary. So, for the purpose of tackling game based learning, one of the key foundations that I rely on personally is the activity theory. So, basically, what I'm going to explain now is how I model systems to try to understand what systems naturally and intrinsically promote in terms of learning. So, one fundamental assumption underpinning the activity theory is that practical activity, meaning making, and learning are inseparable. So, let me explain this. And for this, let me introduce you Panchito, who's been my trustworthy assistant for hundreds of these kind of gigs. So, I will explain illustrating the experience that Panchito lives. So, according to activity theory, if Panchito wants to interact purposefully with reality and do something that is meaningful to him, what happens is that he is going to face a specific context, a specific situation. And to interact with that context, he's going to rely on whatever he senses from that context. So his perceptions. These perceptions are going to be processed through a meaning making process. So basically, this is a process of interpretation of whatever you perceive from the outer world. And this process leads in the end to the formation and or update of mental representations of reality. So it's what you see as being reality. Now, this seeing is not just a product of rational thinking. In fact, it's equally split between being a reflection of what you think about a world, but also what you feel about the world. So the mind works in equal parts driven by feeling and thinking in the process of formulating and updating these mental representations. So, what on earth are these mental representations? Well, these are the representations that ultimately define why Panchito decides to act, what Panchito decides to do, how, when, and where. So in other words, these mental representations define Panchito's motivation to act and also his rational and practical plan to act. Now, the interesting thing is that then Panchito uses these mental images to interact with the context, but the context is not perceived as something chaotic or unordered. Panchito is going to identify in the context pivotal elements to enact his plan. In fact, first and foremost, Panchito is going to identify what he thinks is a meaningful outcome to achieve and a goal associated to it. How do you have to change reality in order to achieve that goal? And then objects that Panchito needs to manipulate and change in order to achieve that goal. And Panchito is going to see tools that he can use to achieve that goal. Panchito is going to see a community that he's going to be able to rely upon in order to achieve that goal collectively. And Panchito is going to look at rules and division of labor schema that will allow all these things, including himself, to interact together in order to ultimately achieve the goal pursued. Now, the interesting thing is that because all this is complex, this kind of things change. And so tools may change over time. Something that is good now might not be good in 2 hours' time. Someone from the community might be gone in 2 hours' time, etc., etc. Hence the difficulty in actually planning and adapting the plan and monitoring the situation, and so on and so forth. Now, where is the learning? It's not at school. It's in this process. It's embedded in this process. You learn and unlearn continuously, and you learn and unlearn by creating and updating knowledge representations, by developing attitudes, so the feeling towards the world, and by developing skill sets that are useful, and of course, adjusting both attitudes and skill sets, all useful to interact with the world. And what happens is that you don't have these 3 blocks like isolated jars of learning outcomes. They work together. There's nothing that you can do without knowing how to do something and feeling about something. So in the end, they work together, they are integrated, and they form sensibilities that allow to think about what is good and what is not good in the world and then act upon it, and capabilities that actually enable you to act as you decided to do. And the point is, how do you support all this process? Considering that learning how to do this in an adaptive manner requires actually you be in the game and being in stressful conditions and tackling as much as possible of the real thing that you can. Now, the interesting thing is that because you want to intervene on the activity system, and you have to intervene on the activity system, you need to identify immediately where you can intervene. As you can see, you have 2 big components that play together here. One is the mental activity, the other one is the practical activity. If you want to intervene the mental activity, the only thing that you can do, because this is not about brainwashing people, you can actually intervene on what people can perceive from the outer world. So you can actually act upon information flows that flow from the outer world to the learner. And so you influence the sensing part. Otherwise, or if you wish, usually it's and or you can influence the activity system. People receive information about the world because there are elements in the world that convey that information. People can interact with the world because there are elements that allow them to interact with the world, elements that mediate practical activity. So you can actually identify those elements and then act upon them and modify them so that altogether the information flows that reach the learner and the stuff that learners can interact with, altogether they can promote the kind of learning that you want to promote, the development of the sensibilities and the capabilities that you want to promote. So, having said that, what do we do with all this? Well, The first step is actually understanding how to break down the activity system that you're dealing with, you're tackling. And again, it's all about thinking about Panchito in the context of the situation that he or she, I should have two characters perhaps in the future, will need to tackle and learn how to tackle. So you have to identify the community, the tools, the rules, the context, the goals that should drive the activity. And then the information flows that eventually will feed Panchito's perceptions about the activity and how all these things interact together. And as you do that, the way of doing it in a meaningful way to intervene and promote learning is thinking about what learning is intrinsically promoted by the activity system. If I have a goal, if I have all these tools, if I have all these people to interact with, there is something that I will be developing in terms of capabilities and sensibilities just because I'm interacting with the system. What is that? What are the attitudes? What are the skill sets? Elicited, promoted, what is it? Then once you identify this, you think in terms of learning affordances. So what is it that promotes these kind of things? How do the elements or some elements of the activity system interact together in order to promote the things that I believe are happening, are being learned in this system? What are the learning affordances? And then for some reason, Panchito is interested in interacting with these things. There must be some motivation levers. Definitely the purpose of the whole activities is one strong motivation lever, but there must be something else. That purpose must be reflected somewhere. The possibility of doing something and achieving something must be reflected somewhere. Where is it? So once you identified learning affordances within the activity system, then you have to think about how those affordances, right, not only promote the learning, but also map to motivational affordances, make the learning meaningful. And you do all these all together, thinking about how you can intervene to make one, the activity more meaningful or more evidently meaningful, make the activity more attainable or more evidently attainable. And I emphasize the evidently because sometimes you'll have all the pieces in the right place, but the problem is that learners are not aware. So you need to work on the information flows and make things more evident to learners, to enable learners. And you have your Lego blocks. So you actually have approaches and have structures that you have to look at because there are some pivotal elements in an activity system that you have to identify whether they're not there, how they interact. And only after you've identified all this, you can decide what might be influential and what might be good to change and how to change it. So, for example, you have plenty of types of rules that regulate different aspects of the interaction of elements within an activity system. You have different types of actors. You have different aspects of a context. You have settings, roles, purposes, and so on and so forth. You have plenty of nice things that you can use. Now, this can be daunting, but at the same time, it's about many elements that should be familiar to all of them to some extent, not only because we're all interested in some form of gamification or game-based learning or games in general, but actually because this is about life. We have rules that define, for example, how we are rewarded, penalized, how we interact socially with others, how we interact with objects. We have a context that makes things meaningful. Things are not meaningful if not contextualized. And why is something meaningful? Well, because there is a sociocultural setting, there is a physical setting, and so on and so forth. So many intuitive things that once you have a map that you can refer to, once you know that these are the elements that you have to look at, it's also difficult to understand how these elements could interact with one another in order to promote or hinder some learning. But that's a starting point, looking at the system. Now, Once you've looked at the system and you thought, oh, well, there is something here, these two, three elements might be eliciting some learning or supporting some learning or whatever it is, you have to think about motivation. And again, you choose in our fields, you choose and you select the most appropriate theories to analyze things. And I will, for the purpose of this presentation, use the self-determination theory, which you've been hearing about, you've been listening to other speakers so far talking about, mentioning, alluding, discussing self-determination. I'm not going to linger on describing it too much, but I need to flag a couple of important things, right? So, you know about this dichotomy, extrinsic motivation, intrinsic motivation, and normally this is presented as intrinsic is good, extrinsic is bad, and whatnot. The situation when you have to map elements of an activity system to motivation levers is slightly more complex. And actually, this is a spectrum. This is not on, off, good, bad. It's a spectrum. And people are positioned along the spectrum at some point, and that point can vary and can change depending on what happens in the activity. It's not fixed. And actually, in complex activities, that's going to change a lot over time, depending on ups and downs, what people are facing, how good they're doing, etc., etc. So what you want to do is creating a strong motivational basis so that all fluctuations will keep people engaged in the activity and will not push them off. But you will have to accept that they're going to go up and down, and then there are going to be some moments when things are going to look bad. What you don't want is definitely the A motivation. But after the A motivation, things are not black or white. More specifically, what happens is that a motivation is bad because basically people don't know what to do. They feel that they are powerless. Things are pointless, non-intentional behavior, non-valuing people, incompetence, or at least they hide behind incompetence, lack of control, and whatnot. Okay, forget about that. That's not the kind of people that engage in complex problem solving. Then the situation, starting with the external motivation, becomes interesting. External motivation don't work when you work with wicked problems and complex situations. Afterwards, everything changes. So you have the introjected motivation. Sometimes and at some opportunities, people might be acting within complex situations driven by a concern for what others might be thinking about them, or by their ego. And that's not so bad. It's not ideal, but it's not so bad. If you recognize that this is the case, then you actually have to or can have possibility to work on improving their motivation and pushing them towards what's better. The next step is what we call identified motivation. And that's actually very interesting. That's very common and that's very powerful, because this is when people accept that they need to do something because it's valuable, even though they don't like it, even though if they could choose, they wouldn't do that. And that's actually good. So you can work towards promoting that sensation and demonstrating that actually something must be done. That yes, you have to study. And yes, I know you don't like studying, but you have to because you like what can come out of that. And that studying is intrinsically connected with that. It's not like a reward you study, I give you a lolly or something like that, right? That's the difference with extrinsic motivation, more pure external, motivation. Then you have integrated motivation. That's another thing that you want to promote. Try to figure out how the system is promoting integrated motivation and bump it up. Integrated motivation is actually, I found myself discussing with people very often, and what they mean by intrinsic motivation is actually integrated motivation. Integrated motivation is when you embrace something. It didn't come from you, but you look at it and you say, that is so me. It's as if I thought about it. That is moving me, as if it came from inside myself, and you embrace it, right? That's great. That's almost as good as intrinsic motivation. So these guys, tough. These guys, yes, they can actually be very effective in complex situations because of their egos. These guys, definitely good. You can work on that. You can work on the system to promote and engage these guys. And these are the best, definitely. But you have to realize actually that at different time, someone who has a strong internal motivation driver might actually flow towards the identified motivation and even the introjected motivation, and vice versa. Someone who is at a predominantly introjected motivation level could transition towards a higher motivation level. And all this because of how you manage the system. How do you manage the system? Well, you actually have to consider that you can, by manipulating the activity system, you can promote need for competence. So you can make people feel that they are developing mastery and control of outcomes of whatever they do in the external world. So it's about them versus the external world. Autonomy, they can choose, right? So it's about them versus themselves. They are in control of their own life. And then relatedness is about doing something meaningful with others. So it's about them versus the others. And these are the three relationships. Now, again, because of the type of learning that I'm interested in, this is not a theoretical and an abstract context. If you are interested as a starting point in engaging in complex problem solving, you already have a purpose. So if I come and I tell you, look, I'm going to put some chat facility in this activity so that you can have, some small talk, do some small talk with all the other people involved in this activity, chances are you're going to say, I don't care. I'm not here to do that. I'm here to solve the problem. So if you put just abstract opportunities to relate with others, that's not going to motivate me. However, if you come to me and you say that I can actually rely on others to do whatever I want to do, that's great. If I find a situation in which I discover that whatever I am trying to do is going to really, really be beneficial for someone else, that's a good level of contextualized relatedness. And this is just an example to say that these three things, competence, autonomy, and relatedness, when you talk about complex problem solving, they have to be highly contextualized. People may like small talking or whatever it is outside that problem. But when they are immersed in the problem, they want to move forward. Whatever it is that you add or modify, you have to push them towards whatever they already are striving to achieve. So, how do you do that? Well, that's another step in our thinking process, right? So, that's a step where we realize or we think about how to influence Panchito, but how to influence Panchito by modifying something that happens in the activity system. And remember, it's always about the two things: mental activity, practical activity. Mental activity, I have to send information flows to Panchito. Practical activity, I have to put things in place so that Panchito can explore and interact with the world in a meaningful way. And when it comes to our thinking process, all this means that basically you follow the same steps. But when you hit the point of the motivation mechanisms, you actually have to think about relatedness and what the activity system is offering in terms of possibilities of connecting with others meaningfully for the purpose of the task, doing something relevant with others or for others for the purpose of the task, and be supported or appreciated by others, but within the context of the task, the activity at hand. And likewise, autonomy, you have to think about which possibilities you're offering to the actors to choose what to do and how to do it, but always in relation to the kind of tasks and situation that they are interested in. And finally, the same holds true for competence. So you want to give tools to make them successful, and you want to reward them, inform them about the progress, all that makes them think that they are developing competence and exerting their competence in an effective way, but all within the context of that task. So it's the activity that drives your work, not the other way around. This is why you have to be, very, very careful and very, very detailed in analyzing the activity and modifying elements of the activity system. And always keep in mind that in the end, you do the same. You want to achieve a more meaningful activity, a more attainable activity, and you want to raise awareness in people about what's out there to do, what could be done, what possibilities are, but also what their achievements, progresses, and difficulties are, right? And by the way, when I say attainable, I don't mean easy, I mean attainable, right? So, lots of talking. And what I really wanted to do was to give you a sense, a practical sense of how this works, because there's a lot that you have to break down, consider, analyze. System, what are the elements, who's the subject, what is the kind of situation that they're going to face, right? So how do we map that to learning affordances? How do we map the learning affordances to motivational levers? And we hit our interlude time, and because you've been such a good audience so far, I hope you're still alive in spite of the abundance of information that I poured on you. But because you've been so great, you're fired. And this is what we're going to work on, right? The activity that I've organized for you today is actually a case study, a collaborative case study on The Apprentice. And let me explain what this is about. For this, I will try, hopefully everything is going to work. And I'm going to shift to another window. So what we're going to do, I've prepared for you a tool, and this tool should be helpful to demonstrate and effectively do a little bit of the kind of analysis that we've been talking about. So just give me a second, and I will get to it. Boom, boom. Right, share. So you should be able to see it. Can I get some feedback about the level of Zoom? How readable this is? Is it readable? Chat? Anybody? Can you all see it?
If you click, there's a starburst at the top, and that will bring it to full screen for you. And then you can should be able to zoom in with your browser even more so. I'm saying that to the participants,
no,
Carlo.
that's fine. So
yeah,
made it more zoomed in. That's fine. Mm-hmm. That's actually what I was wondering. So let's go 200%. Is that better?
Yep, it's readable.
Okay, so 230%. Oh, I cannot go that far. Okay. Right. So, but this is just for the purpose of illustration. So what happens here, what the task is about is that you're going to have to analyze a specific episode of The Apprentice. So you're going to have in the chat, I presume, we're going to put links so that each table is going to have access to a spreadsheet. In this spreadsheet, you will find instructions for the task, which I'm going to run you through right now. And you're going to find an analysis tool to actually perform the kind of analysis that you need to perform. So in order to facilitate this, let me just put in the chat. There you go. So you see all those links. So I'm going to ask the guild leaders to please identify your table. And then all the members of those table, please click on the link. So group one would be table one, and so on and so forth, so that you can follow me as I explain what the task is about. And actually, it's a competition. It's not just a task. Right. So what happens here is that, let me go back. What you need to do is to read information about the TV show The Apprentice. As you can see, I've used the British version of the TV show, not the other guy. I had to struggle and resist, but that's better. Anyway, so you may or may not be familiar with the TV show. So I've included here two links. One is a Wikipedia page explaining how the show generally works. So if you want, it's a core gameplay system of the show, right? And then there's another one, which is the specific episode. It links you to the specific episode that you need to analyze, which is Series 14, Episode 2, right? The episode you will see, it's about a quest, a mission, if you want, that the participant had to perform. They had to compete, creating a comic book for children with an augmented reality cover, right? So they had rules, of course, they had a goal, they had things, and they were very interested in this experience as a learning experience. So what I want you to do is actually read about what this is, the episode is about, what the game is about, and then try to analyze the activity system for this episode, doing exactly what I've been talking about. So analyzing learning affordances present in the system. So break down the system, analyze learning affordances, and then map learning affordances to motivational affordances. For this purpose, I've prepared with my associate an analysis form. So let me give you the zoom out version of the analysis form. So it's pretty beefy, but it should be very intuitive. And let me explain quickly how this works. So the way this works is as follows. You have a section in which you provide a task description, the goal, and you start jotting down what you think are the activity system, the community, who are the actors, the rules, and so on and so forth. Then you analyze the affordances for competence development. And here you have basically, here you have three types of competences. You have operational competences, procedural competences, and social competences. Operational define the ability to operate things and interact with things in the world. Procedural, it's about planning things. And social is about interacting meaningfully with others. And you can see that in this schema, you have pre-compiled categories. So you have to think about those categories. So for example, you have to think about whether in that particular episode, there is something in that activity that allows learners, players, to learn something about how objects work. And once you identify that something, you have to describe it, say what that something is and what the elements of the activity system that should or could promote that learning are, and whether that learning is required, is optional, is individual, or is collective. And you do this for all the categories. So you identify as many affordances as you can in as many categories as you can. And you do something very similar for the sensibility development. Only this time you focus on some sensibility. You focus on empathy, for example, and compassion, and think about the activity system, the task, and what might have helped people to develop empathy and or compassion. And you do the same. You describe an affordance, what that thing is, what that element is, and why or how those elements worked to promote empathy and compassion. And you can have several of them doing the same. You analyze, you identify affordances, you describe affordances. Last but not least, you think about motivational drivers. So you don't have the three categories of the DCS, demand control, I'm sorry, that's another theory, of the self-determination SDT, but you have a list of features, functions that something in the system could fulfill in order to promote motivation. So for example, you have to think about what could allow people to pursue individual goals that matter to them, track individual goal availability, track resource availability, and so on and so forth. All things that are influential, are functional to promoting individual motivation. And besides this, you have something very similar, but for collective motivation. So if you want, the schema, this analysis schema reflects what you should do, right? But what you should do to an extent in real life. And that's what you need to use for your analysis. And last but not least, well, actually, it's not last. The competition is going to have a prize. So we're going to assess your analysis. Each team, we're going to rate them, and then we're going to announce a winner. The mechanics for the scoring are in the forum, right? For the winners, I'm going to organize, for those who are interested, of course, a free workshop next week so that we spend 2 more hours together discussing human factors approaches. And this is going to be an opportunity for you to bring your own problems, your own not personal problems, professional. We can talk about personal problems as well, but maybe professional is better. So you bring your own problems, your own projects, your own situations, and then we can discuss how to apply these kind of approaches to something that is closer to you, which you're working on, right? So that's going to be the winners, and we're going to announce the winners by the end-ish of the conference somehow. This is an emergent game, right? Last but not least, in the forum, you will find an example. So you can look at that example. It's worked out. And you will find also a link that will lead you to a feedback form. So I would appreciate your help in giving some feedback about this tool. This is something that I am developing with my associates. And the idea is that it should be useful for you, not just a conference activity. So any feedback will be most valuable to help us. And I think that wraps it up. I'm done, and I will now leave the floor to you, and then we will reconvene 5-ish minutes before the end of the session to wrap up. Right. Okay. So yes, the competition goes on. So I hope to see interesting things coming up soon. And time to wrap up. So what I would like to invite you to do is stay engaged in the competition, do as much as possible. It's going to be an interesting opportunity to meet you, or some of you again, next week. I think we have much to talk about, and let's join efforts. So you see, I'm developing instruments. I'm interested in working with people who might actually leverage this kind of approaches that we are using, human factors. And what I think we can do together is also develop stronger case studies and contribute to developing an evidence-based so that we can demonstrate effects in a much better way. Feel free to contact me at any time. This is my email. You also have all the contacts through the conference and so on and so forth. And most of the things that I've been talking about are referenced and discussed in some of the papers we've been writing. So I just flagged a couple here, which you might find helpful. So thanks again, and hope to see you soon in the conference, the rest of the conference, and hopefully later on in the workshop. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.